Hi there. I'm Michael Payton. I'm the National Director of Centre for Inquiry Canada. I asked Bill, actually, if I could introduce our next speaker, William B. Davis, because I think I'm just an enormous X-Files fan. I loved this program so much. And what I find so amazing, what I think the best thing I could do to introduce William B. Davis is to say, of the X-Files universe, where apparently every mythological being simultaneously exists, there are werewolves and vampires and aliens and ghosts, somehow William B. Davis, with just a raised eyebrow and a cigarette, was more scary than all of them put together. This is William B. Davis. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much. And I hope I don't scare you too much this morning. It's a little early for that, but so I'm just delighted to be here and very honored to be here. We have an expression. I'm just going to test that I really can actually walk away from this, and you can still. Oh, that's great. It's science. Yeah. Science. You don't know. We have an expression in the theater of. As actors, a certain situation when a previous performance is wonderful and brilliant, and we say, okay, follow that. Well, that's how I feel this morning after yesterday. Yesterday was just astonishing, I thought. I've been to a lot of these conferences, and I was just amazed at the quality of speaker, the quality of thought, the oratorical skills of the speakers, and now I have to follow that. But I want to just congratulate Bill on what he's been able to put together, because I think this has been an amazing conference. So I'm always feeling a little like an imposter at these things, because we have these really intelligent scientists, these well-informed people on a whole range of subjects with a skill and a knowledge that they bring to bear. And what do I actually have to bring to this? I'm an actor, but even as an actor, I wasn't really an actor until I was in my 50s. I was a director and an acting teacher. But I do want to apologize to people who couldn't get the book. I was amazed at that they sold out. I was flattered and very delighted that they did. You can actually get the book, and you can get it from we can get it at various places in bookstores. But if you want to get it dedicated, just go to my website, and there's a way to go through, and we will send you a dedicated a copy of the book. There is also an audio version of the book, if you like to listen in the car or whatever. I did the narration for the audio version of the book, so that's available as well. So I'm going to do a bit of an introduction. Then there'll be basically three parts to what I want to talk about. First part will be sort of my early life, and how living with belief affected my early life and what happened to me. The second part will be the X-Files and what that experience was. And the third part, I'm going to take a page from Louise Anthony's book, or a liberty that she opened up, and I'm going to engage in some political and perhaps more serious discussion on topics that are really important to me from a Canadian perspective. But first, just to clarify, we talk about imagine no religion, and what do we mean by religion? What do we mean by imagining no religion? And of course, religion means God and means all those things, but it also means, or at least for the purposes of my talk today, and the purpose of my experience in the X-Files, it means a deeply held belief about which we have no scientific evidence, or we cannot establish, we cannot prove it. But that begs a question for me, because I live that way all the time. I live by beliefs that I have no evidence for. Somebody tells me, my doctor tells me it's good to have a flu shot. So I get a flu shot. But 100 years ago, my doctor would tell me it would be good to have bloodletting for my illness. So I would probably have had bloodlet. How do I know? How do I know what to trust? In fact, the science tells me that there's no good reason for a man to have a PSA test, that the evidence is that there's no proof of mortality benefit on a broad scale for people who have PSA tests. Okay, but I'm me. I want my PSA test. I want to know if my prostate is at risk or not. So how do we traverse our way through this complicated world? For instance, okay, even if I go by science, science tells me that actually this is not really solid. This is mostly air. But I put the glass on and it stays. It's a bewildering world. But at any rate, and what about, I guess what we might call the environmental religions? Because I think of myself as an environmentalist, but I'm beginning to think that environmentalists are the problem and not the solution. What about environmental religions like nuclear power is bad, fracking is bad, GM food is bad? What about those religions? How do we deal with those? How do we find the science, or how do we find our way through that? But the end of all this is my question: why am I here? Why am I standing in front of you? What do I have to offer you? And really all I have to say is, well, Bill asked me, so I'm happy to be here. So this is where it started. The cigarette-smoking man at age 3. Pretty much ready to believe anything he's told, I think. Depends very much on his parents. I should say, by the way, that while I will talk about my personal life, I don't apologize, but compared to the stories that we heard yesterday, my life as a middle-class, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant in Ontario is relatively benign. But still it raises questions that are of value and of interest. So anyway, here I was, and I was not subjected to many of the traditional deep religions or faiths that Christianity was in the background, but it was never really part of my parents' life. But there was one faith that I was given, and it was deeply held and deeply important to me. So, for several years, I believed he came down our chimney and put presents in my stocking and under the tree. And that was an act of faith. It was a religion, if you like. I believed it with all my heart. And the day that I learned that it was false, I will never forget. Bill Brunt was the man's name. Well, he was a boy of 7, I think. And he said, "There's no such thing as Santa Claus. It's your parents." Oh my God. Devastation. Well, I suppose that's all we have to do with the God believers is say, no, it's not God, it's other people. Just a little confused for a moment. Here we go. Sorry. So when did religion actually come into my life? I remember being in grade 1, and I had some really nice friends. I was just getting used to being at school, and we were having a nice chat. And then a little later, I met some other people from grade 2, and they were pretty smart. And they told me something really important. They said, Jews are bad, because we were in a fairly Jewish community. Oh, that's interesting to know. So I went back to my other friends, and I said, listen to what I can tell you. Jews are bad. They walked away. So another introduction to religion and the effects of religion and how it affects people. But the next thing which I want to read from my book happened when I got to rural Ontario. The family moved to rural Ontario in the early 50s, and I was in high school, grade 11, I think, and it was a fairly boring school, but drama was not entirely lacking. We had a history professor who had already hit me on the head because I didn't have my textbook at the beginning of the year. We were supposed to buy our own textbooks in those days. But apart from that, one day our history teacher was asking the class about the Reformation. This was the same teacher who had whacked me on the head earlier in the year when the textbook I had ordered had still not arrived. Attempting to show up our ignorance of the Reformation, he said to the class, if you had been living in the 15th century, you would all have been Catholics, right? Pause. Anyone here who wouldn't have been a Catholic in the 15th century? Well, to be honest, I didn't remember when the Reformation was, but I still didn't think I would have been Catholic. So I timidly raised my hand. What? You wouldn't have been a Catholic in the 15th century? I don't think so, sir. Well, come up here. Stand here. So he brought me up to the front of the class. He demanded I stand beside his desk in the front of the room. You know that all Christians in the 15th century were Catholics, Lying, I said, yes, sir. And you wouldn't have been Catholic? No, sir. Astonished, he replied, well, aren't you a Christian? Well, what do you mean by a Christian, sir? Well, he began to splutter and to foam at the mouth. Someone who follows the teachings of Christ. So I said, well, I think you'd better count me out, sir. And I went back and sat down. There are a lot of assumptions behind all of that, not least of which was in 1952 in rural Ontario, everyone was Christian. There were no Jews, there were no Muslims, there were no atheists, there was nothing else. Everyone was Christian. And of course, everyone but me. Something I hadn't even really thought about very much. But after that, the students came to me, haven't you been saved? Oh my God. Oh, they worried about me, especially the girls. So it was really setting the cat among the pigeons, as they say. But it's interesting because many years later when I wrote the book, and I had someone help me with, she was a very good editor person in the early stages of the book, and she read some of the first chapters and helped me with some advice on it and so on. I thanked her. We were at my house, and then she left. And then she came back, and she rang the doorbell and said, oh, there's one thing. You don't say, or I don't know how you came to your non-belief. She was a Christian. Oh, right, I thought. Yes, I haven't said anything about that. Thank you. And I thought about that because I don't think you come to non-belief. You come to belief. Surely the question is to her. How did you come to your belief? Non-belief is the default. We're not really atheists. We're just people without belief. I'm not an a-Santa Clausist. I'm just a person who doesn't believe in that. But this is how my life began. But life was to get better for me because I was about to go to university. And this is the Sir Daniel Wilson residence at the University of College at the University of Toronto. And I was very nervous about leaving rural Ontario and going to the University of Toronto. And I'd only been there a day or two, and there's kind of entranceway through here, and this was the common room. And so to get to your room, you had to pass this kind of vestibule where the common room was. And I'm passing through, and I hear this voice calling to me and saying, "Do you believe in God?" I said, a little tentatively, but no. Well, come on in. And there I was in a group of atheists, a group of skeptics, a group of philosophers. The person who called me in was John Woods, who later was the president of the University of Lethbridge, as a world-class philosopher, and knew more arguments for the non-existence of God than I could imagine. And we had a wonderful time. I was wonderfully accepted. But the sad part of the story is John Woods, delightful man, still going strong, but returned to the Catholic Church. Don't ask me. But I had a very happy time living in that world, and I was my parents, who had never really been Christian, by that time my mother was in the Unitarian Church, and one time I gave the youth address on Youth Sunday, told them they shouldn't call themselves a church, they shouldn't meet on Sunday mornings, they shouldn't pretend to look like Christians, and then I left. And beyond that, nothing terribly exciting in terms of belief and non-belief and paranormal or anything happened to my life until this. So, what am I? I'm an actor, right? The show auditioned for people in Vancouver. I'm an actor, so I auditioned. I actually auditioned for a part with 3 lines. I didn't get that part. I got this other part with no lines. He just stands around and smokes. But that's okay. It's a gig. I was paid. Not much, but I was paid. Fortunately, I don't invest in these things because I thought a show about alien abduction had about as much chance of being picked up and successful as the Chicago Cubs winning the World Series, or the Vancouver Canucks winning the Stanley Cup. Yeah, too bad about that. Anyway, we did it, and I became part of this show. And gradually, more and more part of the show. And, it dealt with these sort of subjects. Unidentified flying objects, for instance. And I would go to conventions, I would go to places, and people would assume that since I was in the show, not understanding that actors do the work they get, that I had chosen to be in this because I believed in these things. And they would come to me and they would invite me to go on skywatches, where we could look and we could see UFOs. Or people brought me special information about Area 51 so I could know more about the government conspiracy that was covering up these things. And I had to say, I actually don't believe in these things. Well, once they got over their astonishment, they said, well, why not? And I said, well, the onus is not on me to prove that these things exist. The onus is on you to prove that they do. I can't prove that they don't exist any more than I can prove there aren't fairies in the bottom of my garden, to quote Richard Dawkins, who we will talk about a little later. And they said, oh, but we have proved these things. Oh. Well, that stopped me. I didn't know kind of what to do about that because I didn't know what proof they had found. So that led me to finding, by happenstance, a radio broadcast with Barry Beierstein, the late but wonderful Barry Beierstein. And I heard about PsyCop. And I contacted Barry, and I became a member of PsyCop, and I found the skeptics, and I found all the stuff. I found Joe Nickel. I found what they found about Area 51, and so on and so on and so forth. And partly that's why, I suppose, why I'm here, because that's led me into the whole skeptical movement, because now I had things to say to these people. Not that it would change their mind about anything, but at least I knew what the stories were. Alien abduction. So people believed, many people believe, still do, that they're being abducted by aliens and taken to alien spaceships up in the air, blah, blah, blah. One of the great proponents of this, or advocates of this idea, was John Mack, who was a professor of at Harvard University. He'd already won a Pulitzer Prize for a book on perception. Very, very bright man, very well regarded. And he was convinced that these people that he was now meeting and interviewing were actually being abducted, and he called them pioneers on a hero's journey. They were going into space. They were connecting to the alien presence. I don't know if they were invaders or how he saw them. And it so happened that, again, because people are confused about acting, and, well, I mean, I guess the A-list actors could choose where they work, but we in the trenches, we work where we can. So they thought that I was really interested and knowledgeable and probably a believer in these things. Asked me to moderate a panel between John Mack on the one side and some skeptic, or I don't remember who it was, on the other side, and I was to be the moderator. We soon discovered that I was farther over on this side than the other person, that I was the biggest materialist in the room. But we engaged in this debate, and it went on and went on and went on and went on. He had a video that professed to show conclusively what was happening. But it was clear that, well, it wasn't clear, but it was probably clear to those who were expert in the field that he was unwittingly indoctrinating his interviewees. But it's so difficult to find any evidence one way or another. Someone claims they were being abducted, and someone thinks they weren't. Where do you find proof? What actual evidence could you look at? Well, in conversation afterwards, this was curious because John Mack said with some surprise that some of the abductees reported, the abductees whom he believed every word they said, some of these abductees reported that they had seen him, John Mack, on one of the spaceships. I see you're connecting the dots that he didn't connect. He knew he had never been on the spaceship, so he knew that that statement was false, and that was the only testable statement. So he had one testable statement, and it's false. Didn't change his mind. Curious. Still, I was having a lovely time on the show. My career was advancing. I was getting more money. I was getting more praise. I was getting more acting experience. My work was getting better. And then something happened. You probably recognize him. So, what does that have to do with my career and the X-Files? Well, let me read you what he was, I should point out, at the time, my hero. I had read, I think, every word he had published, at least in a book form. So, when he said this at his Dimbleby lecture in 1996, I had to listen. He said, "How do we account for the current paranormal vogue in the popular media? Perhaps it has something to do with the millennium." Well, this was close to the millennium, in which case it's depressing to realize that the millennium is still 3 years away. Less portentously, it may be an attempt to cash in on the success of the X-Files. This is fiction and therefore defensible as pure entertainment. A fair defense, you might think. Wish I could do this with his English accent. A fair defense, you might think. But soap operas, cop series, and the like are justly criticized if week after week they ram home the same prejudice or bias. Each week, the X-Files poses a mystery and offers two rival kinds of explanations: the rational theory and the paranormal theory. And week after week, the rational explanation loses and the paranormal theory wins. But it's only fiction, a bit of fun. Why get so hot under the collar? Imagine a crime series in which every week there is a white suspect and a black suspect. And every week, lo and behold, the black one turns out to have done it. Unpardonable, of course. And my point is that you could not defend it by saying, but it's only fiction, only entertainment. Let's not go back to a dark age of superstition and unreason, a world in which every time you lose your keys, you suspect poltergeists, demons, or alien abduction. So, my hero thinks the show I am doing is dangerous, is bad, should not be encouraged. What do I do? I suppose if I were Mulder and believed in my convictions, I would have resigned from the show, declared it a terrible thing, and said, I stand up for reason, I stand against the X-Files, I withdraw from the show. I didn't really want to do that. So I thought about it a little bit more. And then I thought, a couple of things. Well, the first one was, imagine a show in which every week an explanation is posed by a man and another explanation is posed by a woman, and the man always wins. Unpardonable. But that's what happens on the X-Files. Mulder's always right, Scully's always wrong. By the way, I meant to explain the show. Are there people who don't know the show? Should I have said what this show is about? Anyway, you probably picked it up by now anyway. So why are the feminists not alarmed? Why are the feminists not up in arms saying, what do you mean, only the men win? In fact, quite the reverse happened. The feminists loved Scully, got totally behind her, and thought she was fantastic. So that argument was a little shaky, but still, I was still a little concerned. Now, what does... Oh, by the way, yes, another thing I wondered was, had he actually watched the show? I mean, people recognize me all over the world, you know. And I was at a convention, so I thought I'd talk to him about this. So I went up to him, and he looked at me with a glazed stare, and I said, you know, I wanted to mention about the X-Files. Oh, he said, oh, well, you were on the show? Okay. But then there's another thing that he always says. He says, about God and various things, he says it depends on the evidence. The evidence. So then, what is his evidence that this show about the paranormal is encouraging other people to believe in the paranormal? I notice a lot of the skeptics love the show. And I don't think you believe in alien abduction. So I would go to conventions and I would conduct at least a straw poll, and I would ask how many people believed there were aliens among us, how many people believed there were alien abductions, and I would get a show of hands that was about the same as was being reported in the general population. So from this very weak study, I concluded that the show has not actually changed anybody's mind on these subjects. And I began to feel better about that. Of course, I did ask them how many people believed in conspiracies, and every hand went up. And that one mystified me, because this was during Monica Lewinsky time, and I thought, if the president can't keep secret 11 private meetings with an intern, how in God's name is he keeping secret a whole world of aliens and alien abductions? And anyway, that didn't convince anybody either. But what all this did was it eased my mind. Thank you very much, Dr. Dawkins, but I will stay on the show. And I did. But thinking about it later, there were actually dangers on the show, not the ones that he mentioned so much, as what might be called the embedded assumptions. The ones that were examined, that Mulder and Scully would actually look at. Okay, so everybody can look at that. But what about the ones that were just taken for granted by the show? There's one about spiritual healing, or a healing ceremony that is the only way that Mulder can recover from a certain illness. And he's taken by native Indians to some place, and he is healed by this process. We don't question that. That's just taken as an assumption. There are other things where Scully's investigating or concerned about things in her past, and so she goes to a therapist who takes her on regressive memory. And she has to stop because she's covering certain things and so on. But the point is, repressed memory was taken as an assumption, an embedded assumption, that we repress traumatic experience and we have to unlock it through psychotherapy. And we know that was a terribly, terribly dangerous idea through the 80s and 90s, and many people went to jail because their children were brought through hypnotism to believe that they had been sexually abused, or satanic cults, etc., all of which has been proven to be bogus. So the show is not without risk in that sense, but not quite in the sense that Dawkins says, I think. How's my time? You see, I took my watch off, so I know the time, but wait. Oh, okay, we're good. So now we move to, oh boy, yes. Dr. Sahel said something that caught my ear yesterday about Pakistan And he said that about the president, that when they have control of the religious, the political, and the economic, they have, I'm not sure how he described it, but they have total control of the society. Is that what we have now in Canada? It's a question. The religious side is obviously not talked about, but he is a born-again Christian. If you are a born-again Christian, you know that God looks after you, God looks after your children, God looks after your grandchildren. The humans are a special species and not subject necessarily to the same laws of nature that other creatures might be. We know that until there's some shift in the center left, he has a locked-in majority. It's hard to imagine how that can be changed in the foreseeable future. And we know that he has the political power, and we know that he has big business, big power, big oil on his side. So he has the economic power. Why should we care? Well, for starters, he's repressing science. We know that. He has cut huge amounts of funding to science. He's cut back environmental studies on projects. He's cut back the protection of navigable waters to a tiny portion of what it used to be. Government scientists now cannot speak to the press, to the public, without prior approval by the Prime Minister's office. The Prime Minister's office must approve the message that a government scientist that we pay for has to report to the population. Is this a democracy? But what troubles me the most about this is we have not yet hardly mentioned yesterday, to what is to me the issue confronting us the most. And that is, of course, climate change. And what can we do about climate change, and what are the risks? We've heard fascinating talks today and yesterday about all these different things. But are we simply shuffling the deck chairs on the Titanic? And we're not looking at the iceberg. And how do we deal with that subject? I've forgotten it'll come to me. I've forgotten the British journalist say, it's not actually about, as he said, the sodding polar bears. It's actually about us. And how do we deal with this issue? I was fascinated yesterday by Peter Boghossian talking about how you confront people with deeply held beliefs about God and so on, and being pre-contemplative, and the way you can deal with the questioning. Because what do you do with the climate change deniers? How do you deal with them? I go to my brother and I present facts. People present facts. Nothing happens. Nothing changes. And as one study I've heard about, I think it's been replicated, that if someone holds something deeply and you present the clear argument against what it was they held deeply, the result will be that their deep belief will be stronger than it was before. It does not change. So I thought Peter had some really interesting ideas of how you get around that, because we obviously were terrified of confirmation, of cognitive dissonance, and we're propelled by confirmation bias, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But we don't have time with climate change. We can't work our way slowly through this. We have to move now. Well, yesterday, the parts per million last week hit 400 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And that is more than it's been for millions of years. The scientists that I've seen say 350 is what's acceptable. We're at 400. When the IPCC report came out in 2007, I assumed we would just change the way we lived. It was just obvious. It was a lot more significant than 2011 or 9/11, that we would all change. We would do different things. We would stop flying in airplanes. We would not have conferences like this, or we would, but we'd do them by remote because we wouldn't want to fly. And yet, soon, everything went back to normal, and we kept doing the same things that we've been doing. And I have to say to the Randy Foundation, I have to say, because it just hit me in the gut, and I don't know, I'm not a scientist, so I'll just say, check the science about cruise ships before you go on another cruise, please. What I've read about cruise ships and the damage they do to the environment and their carbon emissions is horrific. And when I was in the Bahamas recently and I saw those ships coming in, and I thought, it's like the end of the world. It's just coming to us. We have to stop this. We can't keep doing this. But I don't know the science, so all I ask, I know what I read, but I'm not a scientist, so I just ask you to read the science, to check the science. So, Louise Anthony spoke of the dangers of the U.S. government and said many things which I agree with, but nobody is yet talking about the dangers of the Canadian government. And this will bring, I've forgotten how many billions of barrels of oil, not oil, bitumen, from the tar sands to the Gulf of Mexico. The tar sands oil is the most carbon emitting fuel there is, more than coal. And we have billions and billions of it in the tar sands. And as James Hansen said, if we exploit all of that, we're done. We're done. The planet will heat beyond bearing. And yet, our government is advocating, pushing, driving this. And it's understandable, it's jobs, it's money, it's economy, blah, 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 blah. But the risk is huge. I don't want to be alarmist and say it's definite, I just want to say the risk is huge. And it may well be that when we look back years from now, it won't be the American government that we are concerned about in what happens to the world, it'll be the Canadian government. Thank you very much, and it's probably time for some questions. I've killed it. Nobody can speak.
What do you think would be the most effective way to make people who just want to have a job in the oil patch and take care of their family and think small to think big, to see those issues better?
I don't know really the answer to that because it's obviously important, but at least one thing that could be done is to try to control that development, to just say, okay, we've been doing this, we're doing what we're doing, why do we need to expand what we're doing? Why not just do what we're doing for now? But eventually, sooner rather than later, or later rather than, we have to move off that that source of fuel and onto something else, which will also create jobs. But unfortunately, when you move from one economic to another, somebody loses and other people gain. So how long have they been there? How long have they been doing that? It's been there all their life? I don't think so. They've been there 5 years, right? So maybe they can build nuclear power plants next week.
Thanks.
Thanks for your talk. That was really wonderful. I really appreciated the call to arms. So my question is, when will you be running for Prime Minister?
Oh, you know, it's really interesting because in the last provincial election, I was a big supporter of George Heyman in my riding of Fairview, and he was executive director of the Sierra Club, and I worked with him on something else, and I've been pushing climate change in his ear for some time, and he's very strong on climate change. So I worked very hard to help him get in. But you see what he has to do to get elected. Woo! I mean, he just knocks on doors, knocks on doors, knocks on doors, knocks on doors. So, but if they draft me, I'm interested.
Yeah. I'm very close to regarding the anti-nuclear crowd is the worst problem for climate change, the people who deny the evidence, because they're against what's a crucial part of the solution. Assuming you agree with me on that, what do you think should be done about that aspect? And tell me if you don't agree and why.
No, I do agree. I completely agree. And you know, the James Lovelocks and the Hansons have all supported what you're saying. And Victor may speak on that this afternoon, but I know he's quite knowledgeable about that. And newer nuclear reactors that are safer. Thorium, I think you said they work from? Thorium.
The molten salt reactors. The molten salt reactors, I take it? Yeah.
And then
there's by the way, I'd recommend the blog Brave New Climate for information. A little bit on that, also on the integral fast reactor, and it's got a good rundown on why the renewables would be inadequate.
Yeah, no, that's true. And I mean, obviously, the Japan thing was just set us back so far on this whole process. And Germany, which was leading the way in nuclear reactors, is now saying they're going to phase them out and go to renewables. So, good luck.
Hey, just to bring the conversation back to atheism and skepticism, I'm one of the few heretics in the audience that didn't really watch the show, I'm afraid. I know, yeah. And for some of the reasons that you touched on in the talk, what do you think, if you were in creative control of the show, or looking back on it, would you have changed it to be a much more balanced approach of, maybe it's the paranormal thing, maybe it's the skeptical, rational viewpoint is possible, or?
That's a good question, and I wonder what I would do. I would certainly try to dig out the embedded assumptions and try to make sure they're out in the open, and we're looking at them from both sides. That's about all I can think of at the moment on that.
Hi, I'm Greg from Waterloo. I just wanted to make a comment about what you were saying, and it's sort of a question not to you, but to all of us, is in terms of climate change being so important. I think most of this crowd is from Canada, and I spent a lot of time in the States. I actually listened to a lot of the preachers down in the States. For me, it's the comedy hour. But the one thing that I find, and I've heard it from many of the mainstream preachers down in the States, is the denial of science and the contempt for skeptical thought in the scientific community, and the denial of climate change, because their attitude is, we're special, we're believers, God's going to take care of us, we have nothing to worry about. And this goes in line with the teaching creation and the denial of science.
That's scary.
So this is why we have to really push our agenda, so to speak, because it's for the good of everybody.
Just say, don't we, so there's a question mark at the end of that, and then Bill won't shut you off.
Yes. Do you agree? There's my question.
Yes, I agree. So thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure to talk.